Hi everybody, my name is Emer Patten and I'm a music filmmaker and I live in London. I've been living there for about 22 years, graduate of DCU from 1986 when we were pretty outnumbered by the science and business students. So we liked to look at ourselves as a small kind of oasis of creativity with the 80s hair and the eye makeup and the earrings, and that was just the boys. So my first point of entry into television came in the early 90s when I went to work for a cable channel called Super Channel, which was a privately owned TV station run by an Italian family who had a very liberal news agenda. And what I didn't realize at the point of hire was that we would end up with like very little money to make our programs, but we could then collaborate with people like Greenpeace and Amnesty International. And we would work with them and we would be able to put forward a fairly pro-social news agenda for the channel. And that, at the point when that happened, became a real point of engagement for me, where I just thought, this is really interesting. Actually, we don't all have to live with a very right-wing news agenda surrounding us. So for me, it was quite liberating. From that point, then, I moved across to MTV, MTV Europe, as it was at the time, single channel, one voice, broadcasting to the whole of Europe. And I was brought in as a news producer. And again, there's the accusation of, is that not an oxymoron, that you were a news producer at MTV? And the response to that actually is no. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. At MTV, the channel had then and still has now a very aggressive, I would say, in a positive way, pro-social news agenda again. So we were broadcasting to people who, for the majority of whom, English was their second language. So all of our storytelling had to be incredibly concise and clear. We had to distill every story that we told down to their very basic terms so that they could be understood by audiences all over Europe. Some of the subject material that we were covering, there was the obvious stuff. A band is on tour, they have a new record out, you'll do all that stuff. That's kind of a given. But the other stuff on top of that was, how do you tell the story that Nelson Mandela has just been elected the president of South Africa in 1994? How do you make that clear and concise and understandable to somebody who's, again, watching with English as their second language? World AIDS Day, and so on, lots of stuff like that, including the Bosnian War, which was raging at the time. And that was a huge influence, I think, for us as a channel. Because at that time, that was 2 hours flying time to Bosnia, so to Sarajevo, Mostar, Zagreb, those cities where all this stuff was happening. And obviously the effect on those kids' lives had been devastating. And the thing that they had always loved prior to this was music. And so us at MTV, as the deliverers of great musical experiences, understood what's happened to those kids is actually really profound, and it's actually really, it's a huge story, and it's something that we need to be very empathetic to. So in February of 1994, on the 27th of February, I found myself with a camera crew in Ljubljana in Slovenia, which was one of the first of the states in the former Yugoslavia to break away and declare independence. And it was safe, and they never had any war. It was a perfectly lovely place to go to. And at that time, Nirvana were at the height of their powers as an international act. And they were playing in Ljubljana because Chris Novoselic, who's the bass player from Nirvana, came from a Bosnian family. And so this was perfect territory for MTV. Here's current affairs, here's music, here's human interest. Let's go and talk to Chris Novoselic. And so we did. So we go off to Ljubljana, and we meet with Chris. And he's a lovely man. At the time, it was just before the whole Nirvana thing imploded. Unfortunately, it was just before Kurt Cobain's death. He was very unwell, as you probably all know. It was one of the last shows that they ever played. And Chris Novoselic was lovely, and he spoke to us about, his feelings about the Bosnian War, and he said what you would expect him to say. He was a very, very nice man, as I said, but I don't really remember a massive amount about him. What I really remember was that our camera crew, we'd hired them locally, and they were all going back to Sarajevo that night after our interview, and they were going to drive back into the war zone for over 5.5 hours drive from Ljubljana. And afterwards I thought, my God, did we contribute to some terrible risk for these people? And why did they come, and why did they agree to do this? Because on the face of it, it's just an MTV interview. And then I realized, actually, maybe the music was more powerful, maybe that pulled them in, maybe they wanted to meet Nirvana. There's nothing wrong with that. Around this time, with the whole Bosnian conflict happening, through my work at MTV, I came into contact with an organization called War Child. Some of you might know them. They started in 1993, as the response by two filmmakers who were creating arts and cultural programming for the BBC. And they'd been to Bosnia and they'd seen the plight of children in the area, and they were very upset about it, and they felt it was very distressing that there was no mechanism in place to help the kids or to rehabilitate them in any way. So they started the organization called War Child, and the ultimate idea was therapy through music for children who've been profoundly affected by the outcomes of war. And it became the kind of the darling of the music industry very, very quickly, and I'm sure that we contributed to that at MTV. And they started this series of campaigns or convoys called the Serious Road Trip, and they were taking over medical supplies and elements for mobile bakeries. They were feeding people in war, and they still did that to this day. They're still doing it in Syria. And we decided, we were hearing about Bosnian radio stations that had no access to new music. They'd been bombed and shelled so many times, they had no new music. And we decided, and I led this at MTV because I was probably closer to it than some of my colleagues, that we could collect music. MTV gets so much promotional material, people had just get bombarded with freebies. And so we put out an email appeal, and we got tons and tons and tons of music. And so we got in touch with War Child, and we said, we can actually send some music to the radio stations if they want it. So in the convoys went crates and crates and crates of music from MTV, which was like a sort of a musical outreach from one passionate centre of music loving to another who really needed it. The radio station who particularly benefited from that, I've had to do some digging to unpick the story and to be reminded of the name of the station, but War Child confirmed to me they were called Radio Z, and apparently they had nothing left to play by the time our consignment arrived. And they apparently burst into tears when they got the consignment, and I still hope to this day that they were tears of happiness and not tears of depression when they opened the box. So then moving along, again, MTV has always been an important employer in my life, I suppose. In 2005, they hired me. At that point, I had left MTV many, many years and set up my own production company. But they brought me back in 2005 to work on Live 8, which was the Make Poverty History concert at Hyde Park in London. And the idea there being that there would just be some musical agitation to bring some attention to the world, to the debt from the world's poorest countries, and to look at how the G8 countries who are meeting in Edinburgh that week would look at the debt issue and maybe think about taking their foot off the throat of these developing countries. So that was the idea there. So I worked as one of the executive producers working across MTV's participation. But doing that, I met the organisers of Live 8. They've hired me since then for two really enormous projects that have been very key to me, I think, professionally. One was in 2007, which was Live Earth, which were the concerts for climate in crisis, spearheaded by former US Vice President Al Gore, as you all know, on the back of his film An Inconvenient Truth. And that was a big challenge for all sorts of reasons. I was the broadcast producer from the Wembley show. We had 22 artists on stage. Overall, we were broadcasting from all 7 continents. Until very recently, we held the record for the largest global live simultaneous broadcast with an audience of an estimated 2 billion viewers. And I think we've held that record until really, really recently. It was one of the most complicated media architecture projects that was ever undertaken, and I'm very proud of my involvement with that. After that, things were quiet for a couple of years. Then this year, they hired me again in June 2013 for Chime for Change, which is an initiative which is supported by Gucci, so organized by Frida Giannani from Gucci, Beyonce, Carter Knowles, who you'll all know, and also Salma Hayek. And the idea behind that is that one area that when people are looking at global activity and activism, one area that has been overlooked has been empowering women and girls to improve their lot and to give them more opportunities in life. And it's centered on 3 key things: education, health, and justice. As part of that, we ran a huge concert at Twickenham Stadium. All of our production costs were paid for by our sponsor, which meant that all of the revenues that we raised went straight to the charity. So before we even opened the doors at Twickenham on the 1st of June, we had raised $4.5 million, all of which went to fund these programs. That participation as well by the audience was quite radical in the sense that when you bought a ticket, you were offered a slew of options. Where do you want your ticket money to go? You choose the project, have a look through our website, comb through it, and if you don't decide now, that's okay, we'll give you a week or so, and then if you still don't decide, we're going to come back and tell you where we spent the money. So there was a radical democratization of the process from the fan point of view, which I thought was an amazing engager at that time, and I'd like to actually see more of that, because I think that was incredibly successful in making everybody who went really understand what the issues at stake were. It forced them to go, look at the issues, and then make a choice. And as part of that delivery experience in the stadium, we played some of the films that had been produced, which also were running simultaneously as part of the live broadcast. And they were films about access to education for girls in the developing world, very troubling stuff around the issue of child brides and sex trafficking and stuff like that. And the thing that we really noticed in the TV truck with the executive producers was everybody in the stadium was watching the films and they were listening to every word, which I had absolutely not expected, and I just couldn't believe the level of engagement and how mesmerized people were by the content and by the messaging. So all of that has been incredibly, rewarding, I suppose, for me. We do have the old enemy in this world, and that's called cynicism, and particularly around the Live Earth event. I think possibly because the science of climate change was controversial and seen as being controversial by some parties. Personally, for me, it's not controversial at all. I actually think it's very obvious what's happening. But then again, I'm not a science editor and I don't have a science degree, so I'm going to not legislate too hard on that one. But it was tough. It was tough to battle through a negative media agenda and to try to get really important messaging across about behavioural change and the slightest adjustments that people could do. And if they did them, would it further engage them in the process? And then would that have a cumulative snowball effect? We didn't, actually, with Chime for Change. The media response to us was incredibly positive, and that was just a very, very, very rewarding experience. And I guess we were all just actually very relieved that we didn't encounter that much of it. So everything that I've said to you about the road travelled by me to this point is actually as a sidebar to what I actually do professionally. Occasionally it overlaps in a very serious way where it becomes a full-time occupation for a couple of months on things like Live Earth or Chime, but the rest of the time it's stuff that has happened along the way. The rest of the time I am making music films for a variety of clients, nobody you've never heard of, as we like to say. So they're all people that you would know, like the Foo Fighters, Chili Peppers, Metallica, Katy Perry, Rihanna, Beyonce, people like that. And actually being given the task to interpret their music visually through filmmaking is in itself, it's something of a privilege, and it's one that we don't ever really take too lightly. We're always very engaged in what does this mean to the fan by the time we have done what we do and delivered out an experience, either for watching in cinema or at home on a Blu-ray or whatever, how will that feel to the fan? And so that's something that we take very seriously. It feels like the most enormous privilege, and I absolutely love what I do. So I would say in conclusion, down with cynicism and up with passion, and find your point of engagement and go with it. Thank you.